power isn't taken. It's a weight you convince someone else to let you hold. The air in the private dining room of Aurelia was thick enough to taste, a blend of seared wagyu, vintage Bordeaux, and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. On the table, nestled between a crystal glass and a silver fork, sat a single, sealed envelope of heavy, cream-colored paper. It was closed not with wax, but with a complex, knotted red string, a puzzle in itself. Kenji Tanaka, a man whose tailored suit cost more than the car Ava drove to work, smiled a predator's smile. His eyes, dark and assessing, held no real humor. He looked at Ava, her crisp white shirt and long red apron a stark symbol of her station in this world of his. "A game," he said, his voice a low purr that vibrated with authority. "My associates believe this message is indecipherable." A relic of a dead language beside him, his enforcer, a mountain of muscle and menace named Rio, grunted in agreement, his gaze dismissive. On his other side, the impeccably dressed Ms. Evelyn Reed, his corporate advisor, watched with detached amusement, her expression a mask of polite curiosity. "I disagree," Tanaka continued, leaning forward. "I believe a key always exists. The trick is finding the right hand to turn it." He gestured to the letter. "I'll give you $1 million if you can read this letter." The offer hung in the air, absurd and electric. It was a joke meant to highlight her insignificance, a piece of theater for his companions. Ava felt her manager's nervous energy radiating from the doorway, a silent plea for her to just smile, refill the water, and disappear. But Ava didn't look at her manager. Her eyes were fixed on the knot. It wasn't just a knot, it was a grammatical structure, a sentence written in twine. Her heart, which had been a steady, professional rhythm, gave a single, hard kick against her ribs. This was not a game. This was a test, and she was the only one in the room who knew the questions. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. Rio's smirk widened, a silent confirmation of her perceived foolishness. Ms. Reed delicately dabbed her lips with a napkin, her eyes glinting with a patronizing sort of pity. Only Tanaka's gaze remained steady, a hunter watching a still rabbit, waiting for the twitch that would signal life. Ava finally moved, her actions deliberate. She placed the silver water pitcher on the credenza behind her, the soft clink of metal on polished, with the only sound. She wiped her hands on her apron, a simple, grounding motion. "The money first," she said. Her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. Rio's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Ms. Reed's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Tanaka's smile, however, finally reached his eyes. It was the expression of a man who had just seen the rabbit turn and bare its teeth. He gave a short, sharp nod to Rio, who reluctantly retrieved a sleek, metallic briefcase from the floor. He placed it on the table and snapped it open. Inside, stacks of currency were bound in neat, crisp bands. The smell of ink and paper joined the expensive aromas in the room. "A down payment," Tanaka corrected smoothly. "The rest upon successful translation." Ava didn't look at the money. Her focus was entirely on the envelope. She reached out, her fingers, usually deft with wine bottles and plates, tracing the intricate red knot. It was a variation of a forgotten cipher system, one that used physical knots to represent semantic concepts. A language of touch and tension. Her father had been obsessed with it, filling notebooks with its patterns before he disappeared. She worked the string, her knuckles moving with a fluid, innate memory. The knot loosened, then unraveled, falling away in a single, perfect piece. The room was utterly still. She lifted the flap of the envelope and slid out a single sheet of paper, covered in elegant, unfamiliar characters. They flowed like water, sharp and graceful. It wasn't a dead language. It was a constructed one, a cipher cloaked in the aesthetics of an ancient script. And she knew it. She knew its grammar, its syntax, its soul. "It's a ledger," Ava began, her voice gaining strength. "A transfer schedule." The power in the room had not just shifted, it had fractured. The invisible walls separating the server from the served had dissolved into smoke. Ava held the paper, but she was really holding Tanaka's undivided attention, a far more valuable commodity than the cash in the briefcase. A ledger for what? Tanaka's voice was sharp, all pretense of a game gone. This was business. This was survival. "It lists 3 cargo shipments," Ava continued, her eyes scanning the script. "Designated Nightingale 1, 2, and 3. They aren't carrying goods. They're carrying people. Specialists. Infiltrators." She pointed to a specific symbol, a stylized bird with a broken wing. "This marker means they are already inside the city limits. The final column isn't a destination. It's a target." Rio stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is impossible." "She's making it up, am I?" Ava met his furious gaze, without flinching. She turned the letter toward Tanaka, pointing to a sequence of characters at the bottom. "This is a kill order. The primary target is a corporate liaison who manages your offshore accounts. The authorization code is Evelyn's kiss." The blood drained from Ms. Reed's face. Her composure, so flawless moments before, shattered like cheap glass. Her hand trembled as she reached for her wine glass. Tanaka's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits, moving from the letter to the suddenly terrified woman beside him. He didn't need any more proof. Ava had just handed him a traitor on a silver platter. He stood, his movements fluid and decisive. He walked around the table and took the letter from Ava's hand, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was electric, a spark of contact between 2 poles of a newly formed circuit. "The restaurant is now closed," he announced to the room. He tossed a black credit card onto the table. "Tell your manager his mortgage is paid." "You," he said, his voice dropping, "meant only for Ava. Are coming with me, it wasn't a request. It was a coronation." She was no longer a waitress. She was a key, and he was a man with a locked door that had just been kicked in. The $1 million game was over. A much deadlier one had just begun. The ride to Tanaka's penthouse was a silent, high-velocity glide through the city's glittering arteries. The leather of the Maybach's interior was buttery soft, a stark contrast to the rigid tension coiling in Ava's spine. Rio drove, his anger a palpable force radiating from the driver's seat. Ms. Reed was gone, whisked away by 2 of Tanaka's men who had materialized from a black SUV the moment they stepped outside the restaurant. Her departure was silent, efficient, and utterly final. Ava watched the city lights blur into streaks of neon and gold, her reflection a ghostly silhouette against the window. She was wearing a red apron over a simple white shirt, and she was sitting in a car that cost more than any home she'd ever lived in, on her way to a fate she couldn't begin to imagine. The penthouse was a sterile palace of glass, chrome, and marble perched atop the city, like a predator's nest. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a godlike view of the sprawling metropolis below. It was beautiful, but it felt cold, unlived in. A fortress, not a home. Tanaka shed his jacket, tossing it onto a minimalist white sofa. "I assume you have questions," he said, turning to face her. His tie was loosened, and with his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, he looked less like a CEO and more like the street-level monarch he was. "I have one," Ava replied, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "Do I get the other half of my $1 million?" A slow smile spread across Tanaka's face. It was a genuine one this time, laced with respect. "We can discuss your compensation package. First, I need to know everything you understand from that letter. Not just the words. The intent, He gestured for her to sit, a negotiation tactic disguised as hospitality. She remained standing. The letter is from a rival organization. They call themselves the Black Lotus. They're not just moving against your assets. They're dismantling your entire operation from the inside out. Ms. Reed wasn't the first betrayal. She was just the most recent. Rio entered the room, his presence sucking the air out of it. She's a nobody. A waitress. How can she know any of this? He snarled at Tanaka. She read a letter you called a dead language. Tanaka shot back, his voice dangerously quiet. That makes her the most important person in this room. More important than you. The insult landed like a physical blow. Rio's jaw tightened and a muscle feathered in his cheek. His hatred for Ava was no longer just dismissive. It was personal. He saw her not as an asset, but as a replacement. Ava ignored him. Her focus locked on Tanaka. There's more. The script itself is a warning. It's based on a system my father developed. He called it a ghost language, designed to be untraceable. If the Black Lotus is using it, it means they have his work. Or they have him. The personal connection hung in the air, raw and exposed. It explained everything. Her expertise wasn't a hobby. It was an inheritance. An inheritance of secrets and danger. Tanaka's expression shifted, the strategic coldness replaced by something more focused, more possessive. He now understood her value wasn't just in her skill, but in her history. She was personally linked to the enemy. Before he could speak, the lights in the penthouse flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into the eerie twilight of the city glow from outside. A single, sharp beep echoed from the elevator panel. The system was compromised. A fraction of a second later, the silence was annihilated by the sound of suppressed gunfire, a series of violent coughs from the hallway. The attack had begun. Chaos erupted. The muffled fut-fut-fut of silenced weapons was punctuated by the sharp crack of Rio's unsuppressed handgun as he returned fire from the cover of a thick marble column. The floor-to-ceiling windows, which moments before had been a symbol of wealth and power, now felt like a transparent coffin, exposing them to the entire city. Down. Tanaka's command cut through the noise. He grabbed Ava, pulling her to the floor behind the massive, white sofa. The air filled with the smell of cordite and the sound of plaster and glass exploding as bullets stitched across the walls. This wasn't a robbery. It was an extermination squad. They were professional, moving with a chilling, coordinated efficiency. The attackers were phantoms in black tactical gear, using the darkness to their advantage. Ava's mind, trained to see patterns in chaos, went into overdrive. Her panic was a cold, sharp thing, not a blinding fog. She watched the attackers' movements, the way they advanced in pairs, covering each other, methodically clearing the space. They weren't just trying to kill Tanaka, they were sweeping for something. Or someone. Her. They knew the translator was here. A bullet slammed into the sofa inches from her head, the impact a dull thud that she felt in her teeth. Tanaka shielded her with his body, his presence a wall of solid muscle and surprising warmth. How many? He yelled to Rio over the gunfire. 6, maybe more. They cut the power, bypassed the elevator lockdown. They're pros. Rio grunted, firing 2 more rounds. A dark shape crumpled in the hallway. 1 down, but 2 more immediately took his place, their movements seamless. They were being cornered. The main entrance was a death trap. The windows were a 100-story drop. There was no way out. Ava's eyes darted around the room, cataloging details, searching for an anomaly, a flaw in the design of their perfect cage. Her gaze landed on a large, abstract metal sculpture near the back wall, a twisted mass of polished steel. Behind it, almost perfectly hidden, was a small, square panel in the wall, no larger than a dinner plate. It wasn't a decorative feature. It was a service hatch for the building's external window washing rig, an escape route no one would expect. There, Ava yelled, pointing. Behind the sculpture, it's a maintenance shaft. Tanaka followed her gaze, his eyes widening in comprehension. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only one. Rio, cover us. We're going for the service hatch, Tanaka shouted, pulling Ava to her feet. They stayed low, using the scattered minimalist furniture as sparse cover. Bullets whizzed past them, chewing up the expensive Italian marble. Rio laid down a barrage of suppressive fire, his weapon roaring in the enclosed space, buying them precious seconds. They reached the sculpture. Tanaka shoved the heavy steel artwork aside with a grunt of effort, revealing the small, bolted panel. Get it open, he ordered. The panel was secured with 4 hexagonal bolts.
No handle, no latch.
It required a tool. Panic threatened to bubble up in Ava's throat, but she forced it down. Her mind raced. The attackers were closing in, their movements becoming more aggressive as Rio's ammunition dwindled. Her eyes scanned the debris on the floor. Her gaze snagged on a heavy, solid brass lamp that had been knocked over. It was useless, but the decorative finial at its top, it was a solid piece of metal about the size of her fist. She scrambled over to it, twisting it off its post. It was heavy, solid. Using the finial as a makeshift hammer, she began smashing at the bolts, her blows clumsy but powerful. The metal-on-metal clang was deafening. The first bolt bent, then sheared off. Faster. Tanaka urged, glancing over his shoulder. Rio was down to his last magazine. 2 more bolts gave way under her frantic assault. The attackers were only feet away now, the red dots of their laser sights dancing across the wall around them. Just 1 bolt left. With a final, desperate strike, it snapped. Ava wrenched the panel open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft filled with cables and the rush of wind. It smelled of rain and ozone. Go. Tanaka shoved her toward the opening. She didn't hesitate, squeezing into the tight space. It was a vertical drop, but a heavy-duty cable ladder was bolted to the back wall of the shaft. Tanaka followed right behind her, his larger frame barely fitting. Just as he cleared the opening, Rio, out of ammo, threw his empty gun at the nearest attacker and dived headfirst through the hatch after them. Bullets sparked against the frame of the hatch as Tanaka slammed it shut behind them, plunging them into near-total darkness. The shaft was a claustrophobic vertical tunnel, a metal gullet in the skyscraper's belly. The wind howled around them, a mournful sound that amplified the frantic pounding of Ava's heart. Below was a dizzying drop, a 100-story fall to the hard reality of the street. Above, the muffled sounds of the attackers trying to force the hatch open. They were on a clock. Ava's hands, slick with sweat, gripped the cold metal rungs of the cable ladder. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape was now threatening to give way to paralyzing fear. We go down. Tanaka's voice was a low command in her ear, his presence a solid anchor in the terrifying darkness. Slow and steady, they began their descent, rung by painful rung. Rio was below her, his heavy breathing a ragged counterpoint to the wind. His earlier animosity was gone, replaced by the grim focus of survival. In this metal tube, they were no longer boss, translator, and enforcer. They were just 3 people on a ladder, suspended between death from above and death from below. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a service platform 10 floors down. They spilled out into a dusty, cramped maintenance space filled with humming machinery. They were safe, for now. Tanaka immediately found a breaker box, and with a flick of a switch, a single, bare bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows. Rio stood guard at the door, peering through the wired glass into the empty service corridor. His face was grim. They'll seal the building. Every exit will be watched. Tanaka ignored him, his attention entirely on Ava. My penthouse is gone. My security is compromised. That letter is all we have left. He had managed to grab it from the sofa before they fled. He held it out to her. It was slightly crumpled, but intact. The Black Lotus didn't just want me dead. They wanted that letter back. And they wanted you. Which means there's more to it. In the stark light of the maintenance room, surrounded by the hum of the city's hidden machinery, Ava sat on a crate and laid the paper flat. The script seemed to mock her, its elegant curves holding the key to the chaos that had just torn her life apart. She took a deep breath, pushing aside the fear and focusing on the patterns, the grammar, the hidden layers. It wasn't just a ledger. The spacing between the words, the unusual length of certain character strokes, it was a second layer of encryption. A stegotext. It's a cipher within a cipher, she murmured, her fingers tracing the lines. My father's signature. He built fail-safes into it. She pulled a pen from the pocket of her apron, a forgotten relic of her old life, and began making notes on a dusty piece of cardboard. She wasn't just translating words anymore. She was rebuilding a machine. Minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, she looked up, her eyes wide. It's a kill switch. A financial protocol. The Black Lotus isn't just a rival gang. They're a corporate entity. They've been using her networks to launder money, and now they're initiating a full asset seizure. The transfer is coded to a public transaction at the Meridian Gallery Gala. Tonight, she pointed to a specific sequence. And there's a name here. The architect of the whole system. The one who holds the final key. Jericho Thorne. She stared at the name, her blood running cold. He was my father's partner. The Meridian Gallery Gala was a symphony of controlled excess. Crystal flutes fizzed with champagne, and conversations murmured beneath a soaring glass atrium where a massive, kinetic sculpture of interlocking silver rings slowly rotated. It was a world away from the gritty maintenance shaft, but to Ava, it felt infinitely more dangerous. Here, the threats wore tuxedos and couture gowns, their weapons veiled behind polite smiles. She stood beside Tanaka, transformed. The red apron and work shirt were gone, replaced by a sleek, black evening gown he had procured from a 24-hour high-end concierge. A simple diamond necklace glittered at her throat. Alone, he had said, but it felt like a collar. The transaction is set to happen at 11 p.m., Ava said softly, her voice tight. It's linked to the auction. When the final piece is sold, the transfer protocol activates. We have 47 minutes to find Jericho Thorne's courier and stop it. Tanaka scanned the crowd, his eyes missing nothing. Thorne won't be here himself. He's a ghost.
But his man will be.
He'll have a physical token, a drive, a key card, to authorize the final transfer. Rio, now dressed in a sharp black suit that made him look more like a guest than a bodyguard, moved through the periphery of the room, his gaze sweeping every face, every shadow. The earlier tension between them had been sublimated into a shared, desperate purpose. Their survival was now intertwined. Ava's hyper-observance, once used to anticipate a diner's need for more water, was now a weapon. She analyzed the flow of the crowd, the subtle interactions, the glances held a second too long. The Black Lotus symbol, she mused. It's not just a name. It's a tell. Her eyes landed on a recurring motif in the auction pieces, a dark, floral-like shape integrated into several paintings and sculptures. The gala was sponsored by a corporation whose logo was a stylized lotus. The entire event was their territory. They were walking in the lion's den, but the lions thought they were sheep. Her gaze locked onto a man standing near the auctioneer's stage. He was nondescript, average in every way, except for the Black Lotus pin on his lapel, almost identical to the corporate logo. And standing next to him, engaged in a quiet, intense conversation, was Ms. Evelyn Reed.
She wasn't gone.
She was here, a guest of honor. Tanaka, Ava whispered, her voice barely a breath. There, Tanaka's face became a mask of cold fury. Evelyn wasn't just a traitor. She was a key player, flaunting her victory in his face.
She's the one.
She'll lead us to the courier, he said, his voice a low growl. The plan has changed. We aren't just stopping the transfer. We're taking the key. He looked at Ava, a silent question in his eyes. This was the point of no return. She gave a single sharp nod. The auctioneer announced the final item. The clock was ticking. 20 minutes. They began to move, melting into the crowd, 3 predators closing in on their prey. The trap was sprung with surgical precision. As the auctioneer's patter reached a crescendo, Tanaka created a subtle diversion on the far side of the room, a loud, staged argument with another guest that drew the attention of the floor security. In the momentary confusion, Ava approached Evelyn Reed, a champagne flute in her hand. "You look surprised to see me, Evelyn," Ava said, her voice calm and clear. Evelyn's smile was pure ice. "Not surprised. Impressed. You're a survivor. But you've allied yourself with a dying power. Power doesn't die," Ava countered, her eyes flicking to the nondescript man beside Evelyn. "It just changes hands," she accidentally stumbled, spilling the champagne down the front of the man's jacket. As he cursed and dabbed at the stain, Rio materialized behind him, his hand expertly dipping into the man's inner pocket and retrieving a small, metallic object, a custom USB drive shaped like a lotus petal. The exchange was invisible, lasting less than 2 seconds. Rio gave a nearly imperceptible nod to Tanaka and began moving toward the exit. It was perfect. Too perfect. Just as Tanaka was turning to follow, Evelyn laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" she asked, her eyes glittering with malicious triumph. He was a decoy at that moment. Rio, who was almost at the atrium door, stopped. He turned around slowly. The look on his face was not one of loyalty or relief. It was a cold, calculated sneer. In his hand, he held not only the USB drive but a compact pistol, now aimed directly at Tanaka. "She's right," Rio said, his voice dripping with years of resentment. "Your time is over, old man. The Black Lotus pays better." And they show respect. The betrayal hit Tanaka like a physical blow, a look of stunned disbelief flashing across his face before being replaced by icy rage. The guests, oblivious, continued to watch the auction. They were in a bubble of violence no one else could see. Rio held all the cards. He had the key, the gun, and the element of surprise. "You were always a loyal dog, Rio," Tanaka spat. "I just never realized your leash was held by someone else. Dogs get kicked," Rio retorted. "I decided I'd rather be the one holding the whip. Now, give me the girl. They want the source code to her father's work. She's the real prize." Ava's mind raced. They were trapped. Rio was between them and the only exit. Security was distracted, but she had been watching everything. Not just the people, the environment, the massive, kinetic sculpture above them. Its interlocking rings rotated on a complex, timed sequence. A heavy, solid silver ring, weighing at least a ton, was currently at the lowest point of its rotation, just 20 feet above Rio's head. And she had noticed the emergency stop button on a control panel near the wall, right beside her. It was a long shot, a crazy, physics-based prayer. "The sculpture," she whispered to Tanaka, her eyes darting upward. "On my mark, drop." She took a step toward Rio, drawing his attention. "You want me? Come and get me." For a split second, Rio's focus shifted entirely to her, his greed overriding his tactical sense. It was the opening she needed. "Now," she screamed. Tanaka dropped to the floor. In the same instant, Ava slammed her hand down on the emergency stop button. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The emergency stop didn't just halt the kinetic sculpture, it disengaged the magnetic locks that held the rings in their fluid, floating rotation. The massive silver ring directly above Rio, freed from its electromagnetic leash, dropped. It didn't fall fast, but with an inexorable, silent weight, a pendulum of judgment. Rio looked up, his face a mask of pure terror, but it was too late. The ring slammed down, not on him, but on the polished marble floor directly in front of him, shattering the stone with a deafening crack and blocking his path to them like a fallen god. The impact threw him backward, the gun flying from his hand. The USB drive skittered across the floor, coming to a stop near Ava's feet. Pandemonium erupted in the gallery. Guests screamed and scrambled away from the chaos. In that moment of smoke and panic, Ava scooped up the drive. Tanaka was already on his feet, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a service exit she had clocked earlier. They plunged into a sterile white corridor, the alarms of the gallery blaring behind them, a soundtrack to their impossible escape. They didn't stop running until they were several blocks away, melting into the anonymous embrace of the late-night city. They stood in a darkened alley, the distant sirens a fading cry. Ava's breath came in ragged gasps, her borrowed diamonds feeling cold against her skin. She held up the USB drive.
The key.
Tanaka looked at her, his expression unreadable in the gloom. The charismatic, untouchable ruler she had met less than 12 hours ago was gone. In his place was a man who had lost his fortress, his wealth, and his most trusted soldier. He had lost everything except his life, and he owed that to her. "They'll hunt us," he said, his voice raw. "The Black Lotus won't stop. Let them hunt," Ava replied, her voice filled with a cold resolve she didn't know she possessed. She clicked the USB drive between her fingers. "You wanted a key. I gave you one. Now you have the weapon." The power dynamic had been irrevocably inverted. She was no longer the girl who could read a letter. She was the woman who held the code to dismantle an empire. He wasn't her protector anymore. He was her partner. Her first and only ally in a war her father had started long ago. He reached out, not to take the drive, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her face. The gesture was shockingly intimate, a quiet acknowledgement in the heart of the storm. The city hummed around them, a vast board for a game that was far from over. Power isn't taken, Ava thought, feeling the weight of the drive in her palm. It's a crown you're forced to wear. And hers was just beginning to settle.